Game 10 of the World Chess Championship has just finished, and wow, what a game, is what I wish I was saying, but unfortunately we saw a Petrov. So Magnus kicked off with e4 and Jan goes e5 here actually, and we head in for these Petrov lines. So it was a bit of a shame not to see Jan playing a Sicilian today, maybe going in for a Najdorf and taking that fight to Magnus with the black pieces. As it was, he was comfortable to play solidly and I guess fight again another day with the white pieces. He's perhaps a bit resigned now to his fate in this match after those 3 gut-punching losses recently. So Magnus actually dropped back into d3 here with the knight, rather than the more commonly seen f3. And this now actually promotes an exchange of queens, because after Jan captures that pawn, queen e2, we have queen e7 from Jan. It's the only way to stop that knight from dropping off the board. So we had knight to f4 from Magnus, and now knight to f6 from Jan. In the 2018 World Championship match, Caruana actually played knight c6 here, and you can get some really sharp stuff with knight d5, knight d4. They went in for these lines here. But instead Jan plays knight f6, very solid. We had pawn to d4 now from Magnus, and now knight to c6 from Jan. And now c3, just bolstering that centre. You don't want to push on with the pawn at this point because you're giving black way too many options, such as knight d4, knight b4. So that's why Magnus just defends the pawn with c3. He could have actually considered here as well bishop to e3, and this takes us into some of the sharper lines. But he's well ahead in the match, of course, so he was happy to just play c3 and see these queens exchanged here, which is kind of unavoidable. So we had d5 now from Jan, staking his claim in the centre, knight to d2 from Magnus, knight to d8 now from the Pomnishi. So he's rerouting to this e6 square, supporting a later bishop e6 potentially, and clearing the way for the c-pawn. So knight to f3 now from Magnus, the queens now come off, bishop recaptures, and now bishop to d6. This is an accurate way to play because if you get too casual and go, say, knight to e6, then we could have a trade, and bishop f4, and this can be a bit uncomfortable. So that's why the bishop develops first. Then we have castles from Magnus. Jan follows suit, and now Magnus brings his bishop to a more dangerous diagonal here. We had rook to e8 from Jan coming to that open file, rook e1 challenging that, and rook takes on e1 immediately. So although Magnus has to drop the knight back to recapture, it's not such a big deal in such a symmetrical pawn structure like this. We had knight to e6 now, a logical redeployment of that knight, challenging this strong piece. Knight takes now, hard to find anything better, bishop recaptures, and pawn to g3 here. So Magnus now has some ideas of rerouting the knight and supporting bringing out the bishop to f4 now. So g6 from Jan, and he's now looking for similar ideas here really, with knight h5, potentially g7 later on, supporting a bishop f5 move. We had knight to g2 from Magnus, rook to e8 from Jan, pawn to f3 now, preparing this g4 move potentially to gain some space and still looking to develop this bishop at the right moment. And knight to h5 now, another accurate move from the Pomnishi. So he takes some extra control of this f4 square and doesn't let white just carry on easily with all his plans. Now we had king to f2 from Magnus, a logical improving move, c6 from Jan, and now pawn to g4, gaining some space there. So the knight drops back to g7 and it's temporarily had its jumps taken away from it, but we'll see a key way that Jan plays against that in a moment. So bishop f4, the logical developing move, the bishops come off here, knight recaptures, and now pawn to g5, staking a claim here on the king side so that white doesn't have too much of a free hand to go h4 themselves and start squashing black's position. So Magnus dropped his knight back into e2, and now a really nice follow-up from Jan that goes hand in hand with this g5 move is pawn to f5. So as white, you don't want to take here and bring the black pieces into the game easily, as well as split your own pawns, and that's why instead Magnus goes pawn to h3. We had king to f7 now from Jan, a logical improving move, and rook to h1 now from Magnus. So he notes that there's going to be some play on the h-file soon, either by an exchange here on g4 and a recapture, or possibly a push of h4 in the future by white. So we see h6 now from black, and now pawn to f4 from Magnus. Jan now captures on g4, there's not too much else to do. White recaptures, and although Jan can win this pawn here, Magnus takes on h6 now. So Magnus is temporarily going to win a pawn here. Jan drops the bishops back, these get chopped off, knight recaptures, rook check, and the knight blocks. And after Magnus wins his pawn, we note that he's only temporarily up that pawn because the king jumps into g6 now, the rook has to give ground, and black recaptures. And it might look a bit dangerous that white now gets some checks in like this, but the point here is that actually the king can just come safely back to its pieces, and you can't actually make much progress here with white. So we saw a couple more moves here. Magnus remaneuvers his knight into this powerful e5 square, but actually there's not too much to be done here. So rook e6 from Jan, he hits that knight. We have knight e5. The knight comes back into e8, looking at this important f6 square, and also preparing a trade of rooks here down the f-file. We have rook f7 from Magnus, and now rook f6 trades off the rooks here, and we go in for a draw. Note that you wouldn't want to go something like pawn to b5 instead, or you walk into a checkmate in one. Not something we're going to see in a World Championship match. So instead Jan swaps the rooks, and here the players agree to draw. So not too much to talk about in today's game, and hopefully Jan brings the fight tomorrow in game 11. If you enjoyed this video, then click here to subscribe, and see more Magnus games, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.